Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to see everyone. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
How's Rhode Island?
Rainy.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And tomorrow too.
Yep. Good day to study Mishnah.
Right.
Well, we've got a lot of people showing up because what else is there to do these days?
We all got your email yesterday about your sabbatical.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm looking forward to it. It's not going to be a lot of travel, but I'm looking forward to this sabbatical. So thank you. Thank you to everyone. You're very supportive.
Well deserved.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And stay tuned. We're going to have a lot of nice adult education happening throughout the year, even in my absence. So I'll say more at the end of class today.
Good.
In some ways, I feel like I'm on sabbatical.
Yeah, right. I mean,
Not so much more?
a lot of us who are now working at home have a whole different orientation toward the balance between work and home.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But it's funny, I'm still working really very busy weeks. It's just a lot of day to day. So, and we're still, I mean, I'm working from home most weekdays, but the weekends I'm mostly at the temple for life cycle events. This past weekend we had 30 teenagers on the campus for our annual confirmation class retreat. We did not do an overnight in Massachusetts like we usually do. But we did convene. We kept people at a distance. Everybody was wearing their masks. It was a 12-hour day. It was great. We've got a really good class this year. So Judaism has not stopped. Okay, so we're going to get started. I'm going to the recording has started, by the way, so if you choose to show yourself on camera, that is a choice. You do end up on the YouTube video, just please be advised. I'm going to keep us on mute while we say the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we are studying Mishna Berakhot chapter 8 this week, which definitely is light at the end of the tunnel time, in keeping with the theme of the week, which of course is the World Series. If Mishnah were a baseball game, this would be the 8th inning. There are nine chapters in Mishna Berakhot. My intention, by the way, once we complete Brachot, which I anticipate we won't today, but quite possibly next week, or at the latest the following week, rather than diving into the next chapter sequentially, we have a choice, and you can signal your preference not by a show of hands, but in the chat box. If you have no preference, don't write anything. But I'm going to give you a choice of two, and I'll go with majority rules. The two chapters or the two tractates that we could look at next would either be Mishnah Shabbat, which a fascinating chapter. It also gets into all of the rules for the Sabbath comprehensively, as well as Hanukkah, and it's full of all sorts of surprises. The other option would be to do Mishnah Avot, better known as Pirkei Avot. Mishnah Avot is a little bit different from the rest of the Mishnah in that it is not a sequential guide through one subject. It is rather 5 chapters of famous rabbinic aphorisms, which are much more reside in the moral or ethical sphere. Probably you know a good half dozen texts from Mishnah Avot. Maybe the most famous that I can call to mind without even thinking about it is, if I am for myself, if I am not for myself, who shall be for me? If I am for myself alone, what am I, and if not now, when, the famous words attributed to Hillel. That's sort of the tone, the subject of Mishnah Avot. So if you are in favor of Mishnah Shabbat, write Shabbat in the chat window. If you are in favor of Mishnah Avot or Pirkei Avot, write Avot in the chat window. If you are Switzerland and don't have a side, then don't write anything. But those are your two choices, and I will be most gratified to take us into a deep dive on either one of those next. Now, with that in mind, let's tackle Mishnah Berakhot, chapter 8. We are going to be spending a lot of time today in analyzing differences of opinion between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. So just a quick reminder, because this is not the first time we've met Shammai and Hillel. Well, it's important that we're not actually talking about the persons, a dude named Hillel and a dude named Shammai, but rather the academies of Hillel and Shammai, or in Hebrew, Beit Hillel means the house of Hillel, Beit Shammai means the house of Shammai. And the verb forms that are placed in association with the subject Beit Shammai or Beit Hillel are always plural verb forms, which seems to suggest that, it'll say Beit Hillel Omrim, which means the house of Hillel declares or stipulates or states, but it's a plural form of the verb, meaning to suggest that it's a collective, right? It's a group, it's a school of thought as opposed to one individual. One other thought, Hillel and Shammai are not properly referred to as rabbis. They are never given those titles in the Mishnah, and that is because they actually, the people, Hillel and Shammai, existed in the first century, lived in the first century BCE. So they are identified as proto-rabbinic or proto-rabbis, pre-rabbinic. Obviously, they are steeped in the same tradition of the oral law, of taking the written Torah and effectively reimagining Jewish life around the stipulations of the Torah for a post-Torah-itic community. But at the time that Hillel and Shammai walked the earth, the presumption is that the temple was still standing, that Judea was under the government of Rome or the local Roman governor. And these figures become kind of legendary archetypes for two different approaches to Jewish law. To streamline just a little bit further, Shammai is generally identified as the more stringent of the two academies, and Hillel the more lenient. And Shammai is often, I would say, interposed in the text as a kind of straw man, whose main function seems to be to illuminate why he's wrong and why Hillel is right. That's my gloss on how Shammai and Hillel function. I am not persuaded that these arguments between Shammai and Hillel were real arguments between two people, or maybe even not between two academies, but rather were kind of literary conventions used by later rabbis to illuminate the two different pathways that one might take in an interpretation of a particular Jewish practice, and illuminate that while there may be compelling logic to do something according to one way, or to do the same thing according to another way, the law follows the Hillel way almost invariably. I say almost because there are a few notable exceptions where Shammai appears to prevail in a particular dispute. And even then, there's something to be said for adopting the Hillelian position. So Shammai is like publishing the dissenting opinion, is a comment that I received privately in the chat window, and that's exactly right. We're hearing a lot about dissenting opinions. If you read the news this morning, more ink was given to the dissenting opinions in the Supreme Court case that ruled that Pennsylvania can extend its mail-in ballot period than the prevailing opinion. So dissenting opinion is often the Shammai opinion. So with that in mind, as our overview, we will begin. So Mishnah, whoops, I got to call it up on my browser tab, so just bear with me. Mishnah Berakhot 8 actually explicitly announces its intentions vis-a-vis Hillel and Shammai. Here we go. So, Elu divarim shebein Beit Shammai uVeit Hillel bas seuda. Okay, so Elu divarim. There's actually a prayer in the morning liturgy called Elu divarim. Elu divarim she'en lahem shiur, which is a Talmudic passage. It says, "These are the things." Elu is just the article. These divarim, things. Or words, or matters, or in this case, they say points of difference, which is fine. That's an idiomatic translation for how Elu Divarim functions here. Elu Divarim shebein, that are between Beit Shammai uVeit Hillel, between the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, bas seuda, with respect to a meal. So this is the segue. This is where this picks up from where we left off last time. Brachot 6 and 7 were all about, Brachot 6 was all about blessings over different kinds of food. That transitioned into chapter 7, which was all about blessings over the meal. And we talked at some length last week about how a meal is different from merely eating. A meal serves a function that is not only nutritional, but also communal. And the Birkat Ha-Mazon customs, particularly around the convening formula, the invitation to offer Birkat Ha-Mazon, depends specifically on how many people are gathered. So when we think about what does a meal do, a meal in the Jewish context brings together people for a sacred or a sanctified occasion. You need to keep that in the back of your mind because it's eminently applicable today as well. So we're still talking about mealtime. And it goes on to say, Beit Shammai omrim. There's that plural verb that I talked about. So omrim is the plural form of omer, which means to speak. The house of Shammai says, mivarech, that's from Baruch, one blesses, al hayom, over the day, ve'achar kach, and afterwards, mivarech, one blesses, al hayayin, over the wine. I hope you can see, by the way, if you even have a small degree of familiarity with the Hebrew language, this is really simple Hebrew. I say that almost every week just so you won't be intimidated by the Hebrew. Mivarech al hayom, v'achar kach mivarech al hayayin. So Beit Shammai says the order of events is that you should bless over the day first, and congratulations for the translation using the word over. You're not blessing the day, you are blessing God for the day. And then you bless over the wine. So this is talking specifically about the blessings that are recited before you eat that we call Kiddush. Now, Kiddush is a word from Hebrew, Kiddush, that means to sanctify. So when you make Kiddush, what is being sanctified? That's actually not a rhetorical question. I'm curious to hear your responses. When you make a Kiddush, what are you declaring holy or sanctifying?
The creator of the fruit of the vine.
Right, you are sanctifying God, but not for the creation of the fruit of the vine. And that's important. So it is a common misperception that when you say, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, borei pri hagafen, you just made Kiddush. But that is not really true. You made a Kiddush over the wine, but you did not do a Kiddush, which is supposed to be for the day. Borei pri hagafen is not itself a Kiddush. I mean, it is in the sense that it praises God and it brings sanctification to an otherwise mundane event. Here I'm drinking wine. Now I'm participating in an act of communion. We talked about that word last time with the Creator. True. But the Kiddush portion is actually the second paragraph, the big one, right? So if it's a Friday night, and I think we really are talking specifically about Shabbat and holidays here. It is true that you can sanctify any day of the week, but let's assume that we are talking about Sabbath and holidays. So we get up after services or around the Shabbat. Let's take the Shabbat table. Let's not talk about what we do in temple, because the fact that Reformed temples bring the Kiddush and the Motzi into the shul, into the sanctuary, into the synagogue itself, was an appeal to Reformed Jews to have some kind of Shabbat experience. In other words, in the 19th century in America, the expectation was that Jews would come to temple for their Friday night services, but they may not be having a traditional Sabbath meal at home. So candle lighting, Kiddush, Motzi all got dropped into the Friday night service at the temple. But that's not necessarily part of the original intention of the Jewish tradition. You're supposed to say these blessings over your table at home. So you get up there and you say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen, that's creator of the fruit of the vine. That's because you were about to drink the wine, which is, grape juice. Then you say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddishanu, I'm emphasizing the word, b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu. Translation, blessed are you, Adonai, who has sanctified, asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav, who has sanctified us through God's mitzvot, v'ratzavanu, and chosen us, and favored us, meaning a statement of a declaration of chosenness, or the favoritism of the Jewish people, the cherished relationship between the divine and the Jewish people. It's hard to do this just without looking. I can't even do it without, if I'm not in the flow, it doesn't happen.
Shabbat Kodsho.
Thank you. Shabbat Kodsho b'ahava uvratzon hinchilanu. Okay, good. Through God's holy Sabbath, b'Shabbat Kodsho, b'ratzon, b'ahava uvratzon, with love and favor. Has, right. It's really hard to do this just from memory if you're breaking it up. I can do the whole thing in my sleep, but I can't do it line by line. That's fun. Anyway, the point is that the first line declares God has sanctified us through the mitzvot and has given us and has favored us with the holy Sabbath. Right, so the declaration of holiness is actually over the day. We are making Kiddush over a glass of wine for the time, for the period of time known as Shabbat. Similarly, when it is a festival, you add a line that says, God who has sanctified the Sabbath and the festivals. Okay, and we can look at some of that language. Clearly, I was a little bit overconfident that I could do the whole thing from memory tonight. I see a couple fun comments. One from Michelle Braun, who writes, when I was an undergraduate and active in College Hillel, we had a subgroup of also active students who claimed Shamma'ite tendencies just to make trouble. Later in life, the leader of that group became a rabbi. The real question is, Michelle, what kind of rabbi did this person become? Reform, conservative, or Orthodox?
Conservative.
Yeah, okay, there you go. And Fran, more college memories. Fran writes, at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, our Hillel advisor from 1957 to 1958 was Alexander Schindler, who went on to be the president of the Reform Movement, the president of the URJ. That's a good story, and whose daughter Judy Schindler was a rabbi at WRT for many years, associate rabbi. And by the way, Alex Schindler of blessed memory, I met him several times before his death. But I also had the distinction of serving a very small student pulpit in Williamson, West Virginia. I've probably told you stories about my pulpit in Williamson. That's the one where they served the corned beef luncheon on the afternoon of Yom Kippur before going back for Yizkor and Nila. I found out actually just this week that congregation closed its doors for the last time in 2009. I was doing just some Googling, and so I was a little bit sad to hear that. But nevertheless, after my first Rosh Hashanah service at this temple, the president of the temple came up to me and said, well, Rabbi, that was pretty good, but not as good as our first student rabbi, Alexander Schindler, who was actually their student rabbi in the, I think, 1940s or 1950s. So anyway, kind of fun. All right, let's get back to Shammai and Hillel and see what they're really talking about here. So this is about the order of prayers. Shammai says you bless over the day first and then over the wine. Beit Hillel says first you bless over the wine and then over the day. So who wins?
Hillel.
Hillel, of course, right. I mean, when in doubt, just guess Hillel. 97% of the time you'll be right. And we know that because I did manage to have that part effectively memorized. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen. You start with the blessing over the wine. Then Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu, v'shabbat kodsho b'ahava uvratzon hinchilanu, zikaron l'maaseh v'reishit. No, of course I can do it now, right? And with the last line, zikaron l'maaseh v'reishit, means it is a remembrance of the work of creation, meaning the Sabbath, not the wine, right? You're blessing the Sabbath. You're blessing God for the Sabbath. All right, next Mishnah. Beit Shammai omrin notlin layadayim. These are your yadayim, your hands. So Beit Shammai says they wash their hands and then they pour the cup of wine. But Beit Hillel says they pour the cup of wine and then they wash their hands. So for this, you need to think about a traditional Shabbat meal. And some of you may actually practice this custom. Many Reform Jews do, but more do not. At their Sabbath dinner, there are a number of rituals that you do before you eat. First is always the candle lighting. So we're talking about post-candle lighting. And clearly, at this time when the Mishnah is written, they don't even include candles because it is not assumed that the candles are actually part of the mealtime ritual. Right? You don't eat the candles. The candles were there to provide light during the Sabbath, and the only issue is that you can't extinguish them or rekindle them or kindle new fire after you've declared the Sabbath to have begun. So once you say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tivanu lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, light your candles, you're done with making fire until Havdalah the next night. Put the candles aside. Now let's say some time has elapsed. And most of us just do candles, kiddush, motzi, eat. But the full ritual is somewhat more elaborate than that. It's candles. And then we have this debate over hand washing. How many of you have ever been to a traditional Sabbath meal or a holiday meal, or let's take Passover off the table, where you were expected to wash your hands, right? Michelle, anything you remember from that custom about hand washing that sticks in your mind?
Well, I know how to do it, right? You put your one hand and then you pour over the other and then you pour back on the other over the other one. You
Great.
do it from a cup rather than from running water under the tap, and
Great.
you say the yadayim.
Exactly. And not just any old drinking glass, by the way. You use a special two-handled cup called a natla, which literally means the lifty thing, the thing that is used to perform nitilat yadayim. The prayer for washing hands is technically called nitilat yadayim, which does not mean to wash your hands, but rather to raise up your hands. So the idea is that it's a kind of, I would call it a demonstrative piety, right? You are ritualizing the act of hand washing so that it's not only about sanitation. In fact, it is no longer about sanitation. It is principally about priestly purity. That's a good alliteration. Principally about priestly purity. The idea, okay, so somebody writes, I do it every night, right? So there's this ritual hand washing, and in any, Judaica store, you should be able to find a natla, N-A-T-L-A, usually in if you Google it, you can buy one on Amazon if you want a double-handled cup. And the idea is that you fill the cup with water, you hold by one handle, you pour 3 times over one hand, you then exchange and pour 3 times, and then you say the blessing over hand washing. You say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tivanu al nitilat yadayim. Blessed are you, eternal God, who has made our lives holy through mitzvot, and has commanded us concerning the lifting up of hands, or the washing of hands, the ritual lifting up of hands. Now with hands clean, you are ready to partake of the festival or the Sabbath meal. Because again, remember what we talked about last week. A meal is a sanctification of the bodily act of eating. It takes what is most base or beastly about us and elevates it to a level of holiness, or in this case, I would say priestly piety, right? So it's that in a world without a temple, in a world without the sacrificial altar, in a world without a functioning priesthood and only a ceremonial priesthood of Kohens and Levis, the function of the meal is to take on the ritual attributes of the ancient temple sacrificial service. And in fact, for that reason, the rabbis refer to the dining table in a family's home as a mikdash, or yeah, mikdash me'at, which means literally a little altar or a little sanctuary. So you transform your table into the holiest space in your home, where the sacrificial altar serves to, or where the table serves as your sacrificial altar upon which the food is served and eaten. Linda, you raised a hand. Would you like to comment? You just have to unmute yourself if so.
Hi.
Hi.
When does this become standard? Because my father's family, my grandmother was born in Jerusalem, and my grandfather was born in Aleppo. And when I started doing the seders and brought a vessel to the table, just because I thought it was easier to not have everybody get up, he thought that was nuts. And his family always went to the sink. It was like a 13, 15-minute process of everybody using the one sink to wash their hands.
Yeah, okay, so this sounds like either a local or even a family custom. Look, people become very attached to the dotting of I's and the crossing of T's when it comes to their religious rituals. So I can't find a specific text, or I can't call to mind a specific text or teaching that says the natla, the pouring vessel, must remain in the bathroom or the kitchen, and people must travel from the dinner table to the sink in order to wash their hands. All I can say is that that's the way your family did it. And clearly, because that's the way they did it, they were attached to it. And that's fine, by the way. So much of what passes as Judaism is not found in a book. It's found in people's homes and how they do it. And certainly they're not in violation of the law. In fact, most people, I think, do travel to a sink to do it. It is thoughtful and efficient to bring and I've seen people bring the pouring vessel and a basin over to the table and pass it around. My understanding is that that is perfectly legitimate as well. But your family clearly had an attachment to its particular way of performing that custom.
My father. My
Your
mother
father.
didn't have any attachments.
Okay, your father had the attachment. And all I'll add here is that, when you ask when did this become institutionalized, well, clearly by the time of Hillel and Shammai, they're debating a very minute point. They know about the hand washing, they know about the Kiddush, they know about all of the Shabbat traditions. They just haven't finalized the order. But again, if you take my view of things, which is that this might be a retrojected post-CE, in other words, post-Hillel and Shammai fake debate, like a straw man argument, to illustrate to the audience, remember the audience are rabbis who are being trained in the art of critical thinking and Jewish decision making. The Mishnah is a book by rabbis for rabbis. I've said that many times in our study. I think if you take it through that lens, then you can appreciate that maybe the Hillel and Shammai tradition exists simply to validate discourse in the Rabbinic Academy of the post-CE, of the CE era, post-Hillel Shammai, and to validate the legitimacy of making points of Jewish law that are in contradiction to one another, even if an eventual decision has to be reached. Did that make sense? Like, the way I'm reading this is that a later audience was reading these traditions, and that Hillel and Shammai may be deployed in the literature to encourage dissent, and yet without overriding the ability of the group to arrive at a consensus position. So there's still a consensus position, which follows Hillel, but the dissenting voice, as I think Alan commented earlier in the chat box, the dissenting opinion is recorded. And that's meaningful because it encourages the rabbis to tolerate, not just tolerate, but to foster a robust debate where dissenting opinion is not censored. Okay, good. Couple other things in the chat box. Are these blessings technically just for 3 and more? That's a really good question. My understanding is that you are still supposed to sanctify the Sabbath before the meal, even if you are only by yourself or with one other companion. But the Birkat Ha-Mazon, and you're still supposed to do a Birkat Ha-Mazon, but you don't have to do it out loud together if it's just 1 or 2 of you. You convene and do it publicly, as it were, when 3 of you have taken a meal together. So it's 3 for convening the Birkat Ha-Mazon after the meal, but it's 1 or more for reciting the Kiddush and washing the hands. The Seder permits, somebody commented here, my dad commented, the Seder designates one person to wash for everyone else, usually the leader. That's correct. Again, there's nothing that invalidates your Seder practice if everybody gets up to wash. But generally, and this might simply have been a practical matter, too many people at the Seder to have 40 people going up to wash their hands. So one person, and that, by the way, is also priestly, right? That person becomes the proxy priest for the community, by which I mean the community gathered around the Seder table. Yeah, sometimes people alternate hands, not 3, then 3. That's correct. Some people it's 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. Other people it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So you know, again, you can get extraordinarily granular with Jewish tradition and practice, but that's how it goes. Judy, from Judith's iPad, you have a comment or a question. Nope. Okay. Here we go. Back to the Mishnah. All right. So you bless over you wash your hands and then, oh yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So what I wanted to say was that in the Middle Ages, the Jews were blamed for causing the plague and poisoning the wells, and may not have gotten the plagues as they occurred as often because they washed their hands before they ate bread. And back in the day, most people, that was their basic food, except maybe for Shabbat. They had bread and they had something else.
Yeah.
So they washed their hands. So the dirty Jews washed their hands, and therefore, that may have prevented the plague. For less Jews got the plague. Also, where they dug their wells and they didn't use the rivers, which were polluted. But that is also a very fascinating thing, that hand washing was actually a very beneficial thing health-wise.
Right. I appreciate you raising that comment. I am familiar with that line of argument, and who am I to oppose it? I think that it actually holds some water. I mean, of course, anti-Semites in Christian Europe in the medieval period did not need any excuses to blame Jews for all of their woes. And it is also true that when the Black Death decimated European communities in the 13th century and 14th century, Jews were blamed, of course, like they were for everything. And in many cases were subjected to hostility and violence as a result. It has been speculated that the Jewish population of Europe did not suffer the same kind of mortality to the Black Death as did the general population of Europe. And the speculation follows that it is precisely linked to the regular custom of hand washing that spared at least some percentage of the Jewish community from the plague. How much of this has been corroborated by scientific evidence, I don't know, but it strikes me as, having the ring of truth. I think we're living through a time where we have rediscovered the health benefits of hand washing. So please, please, please keep washing your hands. As somebody said on the news the other day, we may be sick of the virus, but the virus is not sick of making people sick. So I know that people are feeling fatigued from all of the, stringencies that have accompanied day-to-day life. And in the most thoughtful, loving, rabbinic way, I say to anyone who says, I'm just so tired of keeping this up, I say, tough shit. Just do it. Just stop your whining. I have very low tolerance for that kind of whining. It's the easiest way you could possibly save somebody else's life is by quarantining, wearing a mask, and washing your hands, for crying out loud. Okay, we move on. So the order, of course, is that you wash your hands after the cup of wine is poured. So usually we follow Hillel. Light the candles, pour the wine. Many people make Kiddush then, up to Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hashabbat, and then they go wash their hands, and then they hold their silence until they eat, because they've entered a kind of sanctified time where they don't want to disrupt the sanctity of Shabbat by idle chit-chat at this point. So once the hands are clean it's time to remain quiet until everybody returns to the table and then break bread. But of course, there's something else you have to do in between washing your hands and eating, and that is you have to dry your hands. And so we get into that in Mishnah 3. Beit Shammai says you wipe your hand with a towel and then place it on the table. But Beit Hillel says on the cushion. All right, what is going on here? I mean, besides the fact that it's a little ridiculous. Like, really? We have to talk about where we put the towel that we just used to dry our hands? What is the deal with the towel and where you place it? In other words, let me ask you this. What is at stake here for these two Jewish positions? And why does it matter? Guesses are encouraged. Just unmute yourself. You don't need to raise a hand. If you want to comment, just jump in.
Cleanliness.
Right. Okay. So one, this is a question of cleanliness. In which case, would you favor putting it on the table or putting it on the cushion?
The table.
Right. You would think, let's put it on the table. And in fact, there is an argument that you should keep the towel, which remember has just been used as part of the purification of your hands, away from the cushion. The cushion is where you were seated. At traditional Sabbath and festival meals, think Passover, people would recline on cushions and the food would actually be brought to them on small trays or tables. Think like a snack tray, right? Like a TV dinner, except instead of TV, there was other forms of entertainment. There were not on the Sabbath or the festivals, but at a Roman festival meal, you might have dancers or comedians or jugglers or musicians or entertainers. So it's not actually like we're sitting at a dining room table. It's more that you would be reclining on a cushion and the server would come by with a tray of food and place it in front of you. And so the question is that the towel might take on some kind of ritual contamination if you've been sitting on this cushion the whole time. So you don't want to decontaminate the towel. On the other hand, you could argue that you should not put the towel on the table because the towel could contaminate. I'm not talking about bacteria. I'm talking about ritual contamination. Could ritually contaminate the food on the table. Whose is the prevailing opinion? Well, you know, it's Hillel. And Hillel says that sorry, I closed the wrong window. Let me call it back up here. Hillel says you should put the towel on the cushion because it's more important that the food remains ritually pure than the towel. You can always wash a towel, but you can't repurify the food if the food somehow has been contaminated by what was on the towel. A lot of this is, by the way, I worked in a hospital setting for a couple of years. It must have been a great act of nepotism. My dad got me a job as a nurse's aide on the operating floor at Sacred Heart Hospital in Allentown. This was like between high school and college, and for my freshman and sophomore years of college, this was my summer job and my winter break job. And in hospital settings, and some of you are doctors and you know this, there is a whole discipline around maintaining the sterility of the operating theater. So I'm going to ask somebody who's a doctor to comment on that. And my question has always been, how much of that is just made up? In other words, have you actually incurred a desterilization of the field if you drop your hands, for instance, below waist level?
Yes, in fact. I remember as a medical student being chased from the open heart operating room because my hands accidentally dropped too low.
And is there science to back that up?
Pardon?
Is there science to back it up, or is it simply you put the boundary down because it's the best way of ensuring that contamination doesn't enter the theater?
I think you try to keep a bright line in the OR between, let's say what's kosher and what's not kosher.
There you go.
So
that's actually the perfect answer.
Yeah.
You need a bright line between what's kosher and what's not kosher. And it's not that a momentary dropping of the hands below waist level necessarily contaminates. It's that you need rules, you need standards.
And I'd like to also comment that summer experience for you convinced both of us that you were well suited to become a rabbi.
Or more to the point, not to go into medicine. Yep. All good though. It was an extraordinarily life formative experience. So, okay, we move on. Now, Beit Shammai says after the meal they sweep the floor and then they wash their hands. But Beit Hillel says they wash their hands and then they sweep the floor. Okay, what's happening here? Why would you, first of all, why would you sweep the floor after the meal? The answer may surprise you.
Crumbs.
Yeah, the answer is because of crumbs. But
Cockroaches.
maybe you don't want all of the little creepy crawlies eating your scraps, by the way. But there's more than just a public health benefit to sweeping up after you eat. The assumption here is also that we are talking about commoners who were impoverished and that even small scraps of food and crumbs could be rescued and repurposed for food. So that's not something that would occur to us. But if you drop a crust of bread or anything, larger than like a breadcrumb, it would be worth sweeping up and saving and reusing because of food scarcity. So you just have to think of how most of the world lives and that people did not have the luxury of discarding even the crumbs that fell from the table. Then you get again into these kind of ritual purity rules around that. Should you sweep the floor and then wash your hands? Which makes a lot of sense to me. But the point is that if you are handling food, that is still a sanctified act. So you would want to approach the food from your meal with clean hands, pick up the food because you might be eating it, and then sweep the floor so that you have clean hands when you are regathering the food that might be re-eaten, as opposed to dirty hands from the meal that you would use to grab up the food from the floor and then wash up after that. So anyway, just a fun little note that explains why Hillel prevails. Beit Shammai says, the proper order is candle, Birkat Ha-Mazon, spices, and Havdalah. So clearly we've moved on to the end of the meal now. And now we're no longer talking about a Friday night, we're talking about a Saturday night meal. And remember, Birkat Ha-Mazon is not just a Shabbat or a festival thing. Birkat Ha-Mazon is something you can say after any meal. And this presumes that somebody wants to make Havdalah after the final Sabbath meal in the context of the meal. So not Havdalah as a standalone ritual, but Havdalah as part of the mealtime ceremony. And he says the order is you light the candle, the Havdalah candle, then you make Birkat Ha-Mazon, you say the blessing after the meal, then you partake of the spices, and then you say Havdalah. The Havdalah blessing is where you extinguish the candle and say, thank you, God, who Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'chol, the one who distinguishes between the sacred and the profane. That's the Havdalah itself. But Beit Hillel says the order is the candle, then the spices, then you do Birkat Ha-Mazon, and then Havdalah. Okay, again, sometimes I think they just like to spar with each other, even if I can't come up with any compelling reason why this matters. It's why one, I couldn't come up with any logic for this one. The second teaching here. Beit Shammai says the blessing over the candle concludes with the words, who created the light of fire. But Beit Hillel says, who creates the lights of the fire. Two major differences. And this, by the way, unlike the comment at the beginning of the Mishnah around the order, which does not particularly interest me, this interests me a whole lot. Beit Shammai says, when you bless over the candle, Beit Shammai omrim, shebara me'or ha'esh. So that the formula for blessing over the candle is, we bless the one who created the light of the fire. But Beit Hillel says the language is, borei me'orei ha'esh, the one who creates the lights of the fire. Now you know who's right, because you know it's Hillel. The question is, what is the difference and why does it matter? What are they really talking about here? Why do we have this picayune discussion about, is it who created the light of the fire or who creates the lights of the fire? What is going on here? What's this argument really about? Diane?
This is the first one that doesn't seem picayune, because Hillel is really saying that God is still in the world. And when you light the fire, it's because God allowed you. He made that fire. He let you.
Brilliant. Fantastic, Diane. perfectly stated. I think you hit it on the head. That what Hillel, this is not picayune. I mean, again, that's a subjective evaluation. Maybe you're one of those Jews who really cares more about, do you pour the water 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. That's not the Judaism that necessarily speaks to me, but I have plenty of people who are all about the jots and tittles of the ritual, and not only because it allows them to talk about jots and tittles. The kind of Judaism that speaks to me as Diane, I believe, is a Judaism of meaning. And this is part of a much deeper theological conversation. And Diane, you expressed it so perfectly, that for Hillel, God is still in the world. In other words, God is creating the lights of this fire, these lights right here and now, which is an emblem of ongoing creation. And you didn't mention it explicitly, but what would that imply about what Shammai is praising God for? I mean, it's not that Shammai is saying, God can take a hike. Shammai also has a theology. It's just a different one. So let's just spell it out here. Let's tease it out of the text. What is Shammai's theological presupposition that informs his way around the language of the Havdalah blessing?
Well, he's more orthodox, and he feels that it's done, and that's the way it's got to be. It can't change.
Right. I don't know if it's more orthodox. It is certainly more deist, although it would be anachronistic to use either of those terms. You know, Hillel and Shammai didn't know from Orthodox Judaism. They probably, who knows what they would have called themselves? They probably would have just say, I'm a Jew, or I'm a Hebrew. Certainly they wouldn't have known from the deist religious tradition, but many of the founding fathers of this country, of America, were deists. The most famous image from deism is that of the clockmaker god, the god who established creation, who set the world in motion, and then said, I'm going to just recede into the background and let the clock do its clock thing. But yes, and the analogy holds, right? So for Hillel, God is an ongoing participant in the light of creation. Remember, fire and light is the first creative act. So fire, whenever we make fire, it is an evocation of the very first passage in the book of Genesis. God said, let there be light, and there was light. And all religious traditions have their mythologies around fire. So for the Jew, lighting fire is not, like the Greeks said, like Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. For the Jewish tradition, lighting fire is an act of partnership or creative partnership with the Creator in bringing elemental power and light into the world. Therefore, Hillel's language prevails along those lines. God who, in an ongoing way, creates these lights of fire. For Shammai, Diane, you're right. It's something that happened in the past. God was the creator in primordial time. That is the fire we praise. We praise the original fire of, creation or creativity. And that's why it's framed both as a singular, one fire in the past, as opposed to the plural fire in the present for Hillel. So every now and then, don't lose interest in Shammai and Hillel when they're hashing out the minutest points of Jewish practice, because you might miss a real chestnut like this text here. You could just breeze by and say, oh my God, who cares about the order of spices and candle and Havdalah and wine and food and whatnot? Don't miss the fact that there are some very rich theological nuggets to extract out of these texts here. I'm going to just look in the chat window. Yeah, the two of them are having a tug of war indeed. Does this reflect back to the sequence of creation? I believe it does. Some might say Shammai is an originalist. I like that. I mean, again, an anachronistic term, but there's certainly a kind of analogous debate between a form of originalism and living text. Somebody, though, did offer a thoughtful corrective that the way in which I have sometimes used the word originalism when referring to constitutional interpretation is not really what the term means. So far be it from me to declare myself an expert in constitutional law. If somebody else knows more about what originalism is supposed to designate, I'd be happy to hear it, maybe not now. Somebody else wrote hilariously, Shammai is the Washington Generals to Hillel's Harlem Globetrotters. Well, okay, well, we could have fun with these analogies all day. Steve Maskett, your hand is up. Why don't you chime in, please?
Yeah, so I actually am a little fascinated by the first half of this Mishnah, because it seems to me that the difference between the spices being before or after is a question of whether it's part of the meal. So it's not part of the meal.
Great.
But I don't understand the candle being before in both cases. And that's what I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can't figure that one out either. Maybe simply that you have to get the candle going first in order to see what the hell you're doing. I don't know. Or maybe it is the candle, the lighting of the candle itself, that signals that we have reached the end of the Sabbath. Right, because that's the one thing that you can't do when it is the Sabbath, and Havdalah gives you the timing of Havdalah gives you the permission to do it. So I need to do a little bit more poking and prodding before I can come up with some kind of definitive answer. Actually, give me a second. I have up here a couple of notes that I took several years ago in looking at this. Let me just see if I wrote anything down on my screen. Okay, yeah, I actually did. I'm glad. I wrote in my notes, Beit Shammai holds that the candle's blessing comes first because as soon as the candle is lit, the people can immediately benefit from the candle's light. And then you do Birkat Ha-Mazon because they've already finished eating. And finally, you get to bless over the spices in the Havdalah. But Beit Hillel's opinion is that since the candle and the spices are both short blessings, they go together. In other words, what Hillel's doing is he's moving the blessing over the spices up earlier to join it with the blessing over the candles, and then you say Birkat Ha-Mazon and Havdalah. So I'm not sure if that illuminates a whole heck of a lot. I view it more as a matter of, just what creates the most practical flow of the liturgy. Never thought we'd get into that. This is a Reformed temple? Yeah, I can't believe this is a Reformed temple here. Okay, here we go. What kind of Reformed temple even talks about these things? Well, Westchester Reformed Temple does. All right, so we're gonna keep moving. Boy, we're making a lot of headway. Here's where things get really kind of interesting. We're still into Havdalah. They do not bless over the candles or the spices of non-Jews. We'll talk about that. Where the Hebrew is not just non-Jews. I want you to see the Hebrew here. Let's see if do I have the ability to annotate? I wish I did. I should. Screen sharing. There should be an annotation tool. All right, I can't find it right now. Doesn't matter. They do not bless over the candles or the spice of non-Jews. With the word non-Jews, I'm circling it here. Shel ovdei kochavim, those who worship the stars. Literally, the star worshippers, which is the euphemism in rabbinic language for idolaters. Not just non-Jews, but people who practice idolatry. So you don't bless over the candle or the spices belonging to idolaters. Velo al haner, neither over the candle ve'al ha-bisamim shel metim. And you don't bless over the candles or the spices of the dead. And you do not bless over the candle or the spices shelifnei avodah zarah, that are specifically used for idolatrous worship. So here you have star worshipers, dead people, and people who practice foreign worship, avodah zarah. And finally, ein mivarchin, you do not bless al haner ad she yeotu leoro. So you do not bless over the candle until one benefits from its light. So, there's Steve just had an aha moment. So there you go. You gotta benefit from the light. You actually have to be able to illuminate your table and what you're doing at this point because the sun has set. Then you can properly say the blessing. But let's focus on the non-Jew, the dead, and the idolatrous. What's going on here? What would be the problem with saying a blessing over a candle that was brought to your Shabbat table by a non-Jewish guest? Which I think is a bit of a reach. I think that you have to presume that Jews dine by themselves. For most of world history, Jews, their dietary practices alone were actually in part enforced in order to keep Jews separate from non-Jewish society. But let's just assume a scenario where you have access to a candle or spices belonging to a non-Jew. What's the issue here?
Are they not ritually pure?
No, so that's not the, oh, you mean the people or the items?
The items.
Right, so you would think, well, maybe the items are somehow not ritually pure. And I can't conclude that from everything I understand about Judaism, that the issue is not the item itself, but rather the issue is that the optics of the situation are bad. Because it could look as if Jewish people, by appropriating these items from Gentiles, are participating in Gentile rituals. I think there's a tacit recognition here that lots of other religions use wine and candles in their religious ceremonies, and that you don't want to do anything to give the impression that Jews are partaking of idol worship or veneration of the dead, which we've actually talked about, I believe, in this context several weeks ago, ancestor worship and the like. If not, that was a thing too. And I'll point out that similar to this might be the rules of kashrut pertaining to wine. Does anyone know what you need in order to have a kosher bottle of wine? What is the major stipulation around wine? Like, you know, with meat, it's that it comes from an animal with cloven hooves and a ruminant stomach. With fish, it comes from a sea-dwelling creature that has both fins and scales. And when it comes to wine, what's the issue there, Diane?
That's a non-Jew never touched that wine.
Exactly. What makes wine kosher, and this may make some of you uncomfortable, I do have a small stash of kosher wine in my cellar. I generally serve it only when I have guests who keep kosher. Or no, some of those kosher bottles are actually very nice. But what makes a wine kosher is that it was never handled by non-Jews. Now, there's a workaround for that. The rabbis later declared that if you bring the wine in the bottle up to a boil at any point during the winemaking process, it makes it kosher even for Gentiles to handle it during the bottling and distribution practice. Obviously, the worry around wine is that if Gentiles had been involved in the manufacture of wine that was now being served by Jews to Jews, it might give off the appearance that Jews were partaking in a Gentile ceremony, namely communion, namely the drinking of the blood of Christ. And as a way, I believe, of insulating themselves from that accusation, Jews stipulated that in order for wine to be kosher, it must be handled and poured. I mean, literally from the moment of crushing the grapes to the moment it enters your glass, only Jews, for wine to be kosher, have to have handled the substance, or it has to have been boiled, which is why most kosher wine these days will say mivushal in Hebrew on it, which means boiled. They'll bring the wine up to a quick boil and bring it back down, and then, you know, presto changeo, it's kosher. This is bad for wine. Wine is a living substance, and you know, you kill a lot of not only the compounds that bring wine its distinctive, you know, bouquet, its flavors, but you also, you know, kill off the healthy bacteria and the other goodies, that the yeasts and whatnot that make wine into the amazing substance that it is. This may or may not be why so much kosher wine is bad. There's plenty of good kosher wine these days, by the way. It's with each passing year, it becomes less and less true for me to uphold the old you know, rumors that all kosher wine is swill. Much of it still is, though. Okay, so there's clearly this anxiety that our rituals might not only be idolatrous. That's not really the issue. The issue is one of optics, and there is this value in Jewish life called marit ayin. Literally, it means keeping up appearances. Literally, marit, that which is seen, ayin, by the eye. So there are times in Jewish life where you simply don't do a thing, not because the thing itself is not kosher, kosher in the sense of ritually valid, but rather because it might give the appearance that it is not kosher, right? So here's a classic case of marit ayin. It is not good for me to take a selfie out in the street of myself not wearing a mask right now, right? Because it gives the appearance that I am endorsing not wearing your mask in public, even if I am totally by myself and there's no actual risk to me at that time. And especially because I'm a rabbi, there's a double emphasis, I think, on Marit Ayin, that people who are the rabbis or the cantors, the clergy in a community, because of our role and our public function, we are often held to a higher standard of piety. And so we just have to be very careful, not only of what we do, but also the optics of what we do really, really matter. We thought about that so much during the high holidays. Like, we wanted to make sure that not only were we kosher with mask wearing, but we did not want to give the impression that Cantor Kleinman was standing even 10 feet away from the next person in the sanctuary. So we really paid attention. That's why you don't see the accompanist. The accompanist and the cantor were about 40 feet apart in that sanctuary. So it is true that there were two people without their masks on for a certain duration of singing, but then that's not what we put on screen because it's a Marit Ayin issue. You can apply this in a more strictly Jewish sense. I once was chastised for wearing my yarmulke. I just was absentmindedly wearing my yarmulke at a non-kosher restaurant. And an Orthodox Jew or conservative Jew who was dining at the same restaurant said, Rabbi, I have no problem with you dining in a non-kosher restaurant. I do have a problem with you wearing your yarmulke at a non-kosher restaurant because you are signaling to the Jewish community that this is a kosher restaurant. Your yarmulke is a visual indicator that the rabbi thinks that the rabbi has declared this place kosher. That was 15 years ago, by the way. And to this day, I have been very scrupulous about removing my yarmulke when I dine in a non-kosher establishment. Interesting, right? So I think that some of these laws, particularly in the Mishnah we just looked at, are examples of Marit Ayin. You just don't want to give off the appearances that your candles, your spices, your Jewish ritual is somehow actually idol worship or veneration of the dead. Technically, can non-Jews handle a bottle that is filled with kosher wine? Technically, they cannot unless it says muvushal, in which case it has been boiled, in which case, and that's what happens most of the time. That's why if you go to let's say you have a Federation gala at the Mandarin Oriental in Manhattan. In a pre-pandemic world, this kind of thing happened all the time. And you ask for a glass of Cabernet from the bartender. The great likelihood is that the bartender is not Jewish. But many Orthodox Jews go to Federation galas at the Mandarin Oriental. They know that the kitchen has been koshered and that the catering is going to be strictly kosher. And even if the bartender is not Jewish, they will feel totally comfortable drinking that wine because the wine says mivushal, because they know the wine was boiled, which gives it like immunity from non-Jewish infiltration. It's what we call a halachic loophole. In my view, it's kind of silly. You're not really fooling me. The wine is still the wine. Just because a Gentile is now, just because you boiled it doesn't mean that anything has really changed. But if you're Orthodox, that's how you think about these things. Steve.
So I can see in some other religions that wine is actually a ritual object, a ritual substance. In Judaism, is it any more of a ritual substance than any other thing that one might eat? And why
no, not ever.
Right. So therefore, this idea that it might be looked upon as a ritual seems a little bit. I mean, I get it, but
yeah, right.
It doesn't seem right to me because it's constantly being. Yes. Everything is a ritual object.
Correct. The wine in particular, I just want to again. I think that these stringencies were largely adopted but it's clear they existed in the time of Hillel and Shammai, which are pre-Christian. So it's clear that there are pagan rituals that they are concerned about, or maybe not. So this might be another example where the rabbis are using the stock conventions of Hillel and Shammai, these very convenient archetypes of X and not X, in Jewish decision making, right? This is how I framed Hillel and Shammai. Maybe they were real people, maybe these were real academies, but even if that's the case, or even if they weren't, the way in which the Mishnah uses them is often to illustrate some larger point about how Jewish decision making happens. It validates the dissenting opinion without actually suggesting that both opinions are equally valid. Further, I would say, what if the writers of the Mishnah were using Hillel and Shammai to substantiate a Jewish wariness of being seen as keeping company with Christians? Because remember, the Mishnah is very much a post-Christian phenomenon. The Mishnah is growing up, as it were, is being compiled in the era of the church fathers. So this is a conjecture that I think would be worth my study. Maybe I'll look at this on sabbatical, because I'm fascinated by medieval and ancient Jewish-Christian relations. It's one of my areas of deepest academic interest. So this just came to mind, Steve, as you asked the question, and it feels right to me. I would want to go and do some poking and prodding, because I'm sure we're not the first Jews to think of this. But what if the Mishnah is using Shammai and Hillel as a kind of an encoded polemic against Christianity, as a way of shoring up their case that Jews should not be doing things that could be construed as Christian? And wine drinking in Christianity is particularly problematic, right? I mean, it's not just any religious ritual. The transubstantiated blood of Christ being ingested is an act of specific Christian piety. And so I think there was a lot at stake for the early Jewish community that was at such pains to define themselves and differentiate themselves against nascent Christianity that I can identify with the rabbis of the Mishnah being very anxious about that. I cannot identify a putative Beit Shammai or Beit Hillel in the century before Christ being nearly as anxious about it, which is why I think my hypothesis here is that the rabbis of the Mishnah use Beit Shammai and Hillel, these characters, to substantiate a post-Christian point of Jewish practice. Did that make sense? Because that was all just kind of an ad lib, but I'm trying to get inside of the question and explain why would the rabbis have such anxiety about this? And then if so, does it follow that Shammai and Hillel would have had the same anxiety if Shammai and Hillel ever lived? I have to say that just because they're sort of like Socrates is in Greek philosophical literature. You know that there's no evidence of an actual Socrates. Socrates is the character that Plato claims to have learned his wisdom from. So there's a lot written about Socrates, but we don't actually have any literature written by Socrates. We have a lot of sayings that are attributed to Socrates and traditions that are associated with Socrates. But again, we don't have Socrates saying, here's what I believe. So was Plato's teacher Socrates? Or was Socrates a kind of made-up figure whom Plato uses to shore up his own authority in matters of philosophy? They're saying, well, no, it's not just my tradition. I got this from the big guy. I got this from Socrates. By the way, I think Moses throughout much of the Torah functions in exactly the same way. You want to make something authoritative, you just say Moses gave it to the people at Sinai. Doesn't mean that Moses actually gave it to the people at Sinai. This is where we're deep into my favorite field of inquiry, which is the history of interpretation. Socrates was that era's yogi, or Yoda. Okay, let's move on. Okay, good. So I knew we'd go down some good rabbit holes today, and I'm grateful that we are. Next. Misha achal v'shachach v'lo verach. Okay, so what about a person who ate and then forgot to say the blessing? This is we're still on Birkat Ha-Mazon. You had a big meal, you drank maybe a little too much, and then you realize, oh my God, I didn't make Birkat Ha-Mazon. Beit Shammai says he must return to the place where he ate and say the blessing. Okay, so you've just had a meal with the Shapiros and the Horowitzes, and it was wonderful, but it's a 45-minute walk from your home. You have this great meal, you leave without saying Birkat Ha-Mazon, you get home and you're like, you burp, and you're like, oh my God, I forgot to say Birkat Ha-Mazon, I had this great meal. Shammai says, go all the way back to the Shapiro's home, knock on the door and say, we forgot to do Birkat Ha-Mazon. This is where Shammai's stringency sometimes reaches a point of absurdity, because Beit Hillel comes along and he says he should say it in the place where he remembered. In other words, once he got home, he belched, he remembered he had this great meal. The belching is important, by the way, we're getting to that. I'm not just being funny. And then you just say it in your own home. It still counts, even if you're not at this, and this is, remember, if the meal is a sacramental act, right? If the meal is an act of turning your table into the holy altar, there's some logic behind Beit Shammai saying, go back to the table because that's the site of holiness. Hillel says, no. It's more about you and your body. You've taken in the food. You thank God wherever you are. Until when? How long can this go on? Is it 45 minutes after eating? Is it an hour after eating? Is it 3 hours after eating? He says until sufficient time has passed for the food in his stomach to be digested. I don't know, the next morning maybe, right? You could wake up the next morning and say, I don't know, and we had a lot of wine last night. I'm not sure we ever did Birkat Ha-Mazon. I'm not hungry enough for breakfast. I can still say it. That's the point. So Hillel gives a very long window for you to forget and remember that you still can do a Birkat Ha-Mazon. In some ways, we're kind of back to the same line of thinking that informed up until when can you say the Shema. Remember, that's the very first question in the Mishnah. Ad matai, or ematai, up until what time is one able to say the Shema at night? Up until the priests take of their truma, or up until the third watch, or whatever the case may be. So in this case, it's a bodily thing. And that's again, we're back to kind of like these bigger debates over what is a meal. And it seems that for Shammai, the focus of the meal is on the community that you're with and the place where you are. The meal is very much about place and people. For Hillel, it seems that there's a little bit more about you and your gut and your body, that this is an act of physical sustenance. Just interesting to see, or to conjecture around the possible reasons why Shammai and Hillel would have these different opinions, or more to the point, why the rabbis of the Mishnah would have these different opinions and then attribute them to Shammai and Hillel. Again, we just don't know if the rabbis of the Mishnah, writing in the 2nd or the 3rd century of the Common Era, had access to documents that said, here's what Hillel said, here's what Shammai said. My conjecture is probably not, and that a lot of this is just stock characters deployed to show a kind of a dialectic approach to Jewish decision-making. Steve, is your hand still up, or was that from before?
No, it's new. It's because I agree with you. This is another one of those things where the difference seems pretty big on the theological front, because this concept of the place where a sacrifice is made changes to the table, but Hillel goes further and says, yeah, but it really, God is everywhere. And blessing God can happen anywhere within, and what you're blessing about is why there would be this time constraint, I guess.
That's right. That's great. I think exactly right. Okay. The last Mishnah, 8:8. If wine comes to them after the food and there was only that cup. So in other words, and often this is what happens. You still have a cup of wine left over to enjoy at the end of the meal. Any of us, I mean, it's been a real long time since I've had a long meal out. I haven't really taken more than, I can probably count my meals out during the pandemic on one hand. Maybe now we're up to both hands. But let's say wine comes after the food and there's only that cup of wine in your hands. Shammai says you bless over the wine. You say the Brei Pri Hagafen, presumably the one for the Havdalah. I'm not sure on that. And then you would bless over the food. So it's not clear if this refers to the wine, because if you have wine that is served at the beginning of the meal, Brei Pri Hagafen, you don't have to do it again at the end. But Shammai says you would say the blessing over the wine and then you'd make your Birkat Ha-Mazon. But Beit Hillel says it's the other way around. You do your Birkat Ha-Mazon and then you would say the blessing over the wine. Okay, again, it's one of these questions about order that doesn't particularly interest me. I have some thoughts on it if you're curious. The second line, however, interests me substantially. They answer Amen after a blessing said by an Israelite. So if the person leading Birkat Ha-Mazon is Jewish, everyone can say Amen, and it counts as your blessing. That's a general precept, by the way, that if you say Amen to somebody else's blessing, it is valid as if you said it yourself. That's what Amen is. Amen is, I affirm. Literally, Amen is a word that means assent, or confirmation. I confirm what has just been said. It's from emunah, the word for faith, comes from Amen, the act of confirming or assenting. So Amen is, me too. I'm with you on that prayer. And by the way, in communities where there's a high degree of illiteracy, the practice of saying Amen makes it possible for everyone to be counted in the prayers, even if they don't know the language of the prayers. It's sufficient for a person who does not know the prayer simply to say Amen to somebody else's prayer, and they have not failed they are not culpable. They have fulfilled their responsibility. In the language of the Mishnah, they're yotze. They have gone out from their obligation. So you say Amen after a blessing said by a Jew, an Israelite, but you do not answer Amen after a blessing said by a Samaritan, unless you hear the whole blessing and you are sure that the Samaritan said it correctly. So this comes from a time and place where it was assumed that there's a group of people who are, let's call them Jew-ish, right? They're not Jewish, they're Jew-ish or Jew-adjacent. These are the Samaritans. We've actually heard about them before. And it seems that the rabbis of the Mishnaic period are aware of this community of people who are of the same ancestry as the Israelite or Jewish community, but whose practices have deviated away, and they are wrestling at many different turns in the Mishnah with, are the Samaritans Jewish? Are they Jewish? Or are they just not Jewish at all? And to what extent do we include them in our practices? It's very hard for me to come up with a contemporary analogy for this. I mean, obviously, certain Orthodox communities approach Reform Jews the way that the Mishnaic rabbis approach the Samaritans. But even that's not fair, because even the most Orthodox of rabbis, they might say that I'm a heretic, they might say that I am a fallen Jew, but they would never say that I am not a Jew. My Jewish status is incontrovertible. Kelly's Jewish status is much more dubious from an Orthodox standpoint because she was converted by a Reform Beit Din that featured a female participant and a number of other challenges to the authority under which Kelly was brought into the covenant of the Jewish people. That's different. I'm talking about somebody like me who's a born Jew, 2 Jewish parents who are in class with us today. The Orthodox would still never say that I'm not Jewish. They might say I'm not a rabbi, but nobody would ever say I'm not Jewish. So the Samaritans are not a great analogy here. I invite your thoughts or questions on anything from Mishnah 8:8. And you can just unmute yourself if you'd like to chime in.
I'd like to say that the idea of the church, and the church was all of Christendom, well, there was the Eastern Orthodox, but they also believed in the blood and the body of Jesus being transformed with the wafer that looks like a matzah, same consistency, and the wine. So it's very understandable that there would be all these rules to protect ourselves, our identity, and our individuality as a different religion.
Thank you. That I think is the larger context.
You said that. You said it better. But
No. You said it, but you affirmed it because it's a consistent theme of Mishnah chapter 8. In other words, look, we could study this text at a very surface level, and you could come away from today's deep dive into Mishna Berakhot 8 and say, yeah, it's all about the order in which you say the Birkat Ha-Mazon and the Havdalah prayers. If that was your takeaway from today, I think you missed the opportunity to see the larger forces at work in this text. And I think that one of the key themes of Mishna Berakhot 8 is the lengths to which the rabbinic community wanted to go to ensure the distinctiveness, the separateness, and the integrity would be the right word, of the ancient Jewish community, particularly in the face of the growing threat of a Christian community that is rising in numbers and popularity. I think that's the subtext through which we should look at these texts today. And I would add, by the way, the Christians also had their own issue with defining themselves against both Jews and Samaritans. The Samaritans are kind of in this middle category. Probably the way you are most familiar with the word Samaritan is through the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? And colloquially, we refer to a Good Samaritan as like the Hebrew equivalent is a lamed vavnik, a person who just, without any prompting, does good deeds all the time, right? Or a person who just, with no thought of personal gain or self-benefit, does good for another person. That is Jesus's parable of the Good Samaritan. But what most people don't know, or I should say what most Jewish people don't know, is that when the Gospels talk about the Good Samaritan, they were actually polemicizing against the widespread view of the early Christian community that Samaritans were wicked and a threat to Christians. The point of Jesus's parable is to say, no, this was a good Samaritan. You should withhold judgment about Samaritans in general, because look at what this Samaritan did for the poor man that he encountered along the way who was in distress. Follow? So the point of a good Samaritan is that it was ironic that Jesus is teaching about a good Samaritan. So ironically, good and Samaritan up until that parable were considered to be oxymoronic. Oh, the Samaritans are bad. And Jesus comes along and says, let me tell you a story about this good Samaritan. And by so doing, he kind of rehabilitates the reputation of the Samaritan in general. So all I want to say is that both Jews and Christians were wary of this group of Samaritans. For the Jew, I think the question is he one of us or is he something else? And so they're very circumspect about dining with Samaritans and allowing Samaritans to lead Israelite or Jewish rituals, but they still make it permissible to say amen to a Samaritan's prayer as long as you've heard the whole prayer and he did it right, then you say amen. It's kind of not very nice to the Samaritan. I can imagine the Samaritan rolling his eyes going, really? These rabbis are going to sit around and check that I've got every vowel in place? Joe, you had a hand up.
The chronology of some of the comments started with you and a reference to baseball. Then Fran brought up something about basketball. And then you mentioned a word, I'll bring it up in a minute, a little later on. I think we can come away, at least I come away, with the idea that there are different ways to do things and they're not all wrong. They could be both right. And it reminds me, it tells me that I think I heard this one time, that Yogi Berra studied with Shammai and Hillel, because he has this expression, when you come to a road, when you come to a fork in the road, take it.
Take. That's great. That's great. That's very Yogi Berra. That is a Yogi Berra. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Coach. Barbara.
Isn't there a Catholic premise that Jesus will return for the second coming of Jesus only when the Jews are reunited under one people?
Yes.
So
and that informed, by the way, much evangelical support for the state of Israel.
So
that's sort of the underlying theological premise that animates most evangelical support for Israel. You know, the real community that the president is trying to curry favor with in terms of Israel policy and Israel attitudes is not so much the American Jewish community, though I'm sure the Florida vote counts in his estimation, but it is the evangelical community. And the evangelical community has, for the last 25, 30 years or so, demonstrated a kind of rock-ribbed support for Israel. But if you really get into the weeds on what do evangelicals believe about Israel, they believe that all of the Jews have to be ingathered to the Holy Land in order for the Messiah to come and Jesus to arrive again for the second coming. That Jewish sovereignty and conglomeration in the land of Israel, in the biblical homeland, is a precondition for Jesus' second coming. So that's why any Jew should feel a little bit squeamish. You should just know who your bedfellows are if you are very excited about evangelical support for Israel. And by the way, I've kind of, in my view, support for Israel is a good thing. You just got to know what it comes from, right? What are people's motivations? I'm not saying to, devalue it. I'm just simply saying be aware of what animates evangelical support for Israel.
Right. But at that time, was the push on for everybody to be under one roof for Jesus to come back? Or is that?
I don't think so. No. I think that creeps its way into Christian theology much later. I mean, I'd need to know more about when the book of Revelation is written. That's the last book in the so-called New Testament or in the Christian scriptures that articulates some of this theology. It's not like it's new, but it's also, I wonder if it's pre or post-Mishnaic. I have a feeling it's post-Mishnaic. We can look that up. Somebody can easily Google when was the book of Revelation written. Not Revelations, but Revelation. It's the last book in the New Testament. If somebody finds it, let us know. Okay, we have time to do one more Mishnah, and it's going to be a teaser for next week. So we're going to start the first Mishnah of chapter 9, which is a wonderful final foray into the art and act of prayer and saying blessings. So we've come a long way. Good job, everyone. Here we go. If you look at Mishnah chapter 9, you'll see that we're now onto a new subject. Oops, sorry, that's the wrong page. That's 8, 9. So here we are. One moment. Thank you. Excellent. Mishnah Berakhot, chapter 9, Mishnah 1. In Hebrew first. Haro'eh makom, the one who sees a place, she'na'asuvo nisim, where nisim were performed, where a nes, like on a Hanukkah dreidel, the nun stands for nes, from the phrase nes gadol hayasham, a great miracle happened there. So a nes is a miracle, nisim is plural. So if one sees a place where miracles were performed LeYisrael, for Israel, for the Jewish people, Omer, that person says, Baruch she'asa nisim la'avotenu b'makom hazeh. I'll finish the Mishnah and then we'll go on. Makom she'ne'ekra mimenu avodah zarah, if you run into a place where idolatry has been uprooted, so a destroyed pagan shrine, right? If you come to a ruin of a pagan shrine, Omer, you say, Baruch she'akar avodah zarah me artzenu. Blessed be the one who has removed idolatry from our land. Notice, first of all, the transition. We're no longer talking about Birkat Ha-Mazon. We're talking about new and different blessings of circumstance. In other words, the whole last chapter of Mishna Berakhot, all of chapter 9, are on a great number of blessings that you say according to a circumstance that befalls you, something you are seeing or witnessing, or a place where you happen to be located. Special places and special events warrant special blessings. So we're going to learn next week a huge number of blessings, some of which may be familiar, many of which may be new to you. The blessing, for instance, upon seeing a comet or a meteor, the blessing upon seeing a rainbow. I don't know if it's in here, but there's also a blessing upon seeing a king. There's a blessing for seeing a great sage. There's a blessing for convening with huge numbers of people, not for a meal, but a large throng of Jews. So for instance, if you, my first act of, civil protest was to participate in the March on Washington when Gorbachev was meeting with Reagan in 1989. I and my dad and my friend Josh Axelrod all went down on a bus from the JCC of Allentown, Pennsylvania. I was 15 years old at the time, to protest the plight of Soviet Jewry. There were about 400,000 people at that march, and most of them were Jews. And that would have occasioned saying the proper blessing for a massive gathering of Jewish people. There's a blessing even for seeing a person who is very ugly. We're going to talk about these blessings next time. But notice where we begin. We begin with a place where miracles were performed for the Jewish people and the blessing for a place where idolatry was uprooted from among the Jewish people. I think the idea here is that we start with those two blessings because they create a bridge to what we were just talking about, or bridge from what we were just talking about, right? It's a segue. Fran points out that WRT had buses to DC also in 1989. That's nice to know. That might have been the first time any of us actually were within spitting distance of one another. Revelation was written around the year 96, earlier than I thought. So maybe, Barbara, you're right. Maybe the rabbis of the Mishnah are responding to this theology of the ingathering of the exiles before the second coming of Christ. That's a good one for me to look up. I don't know. We are almost out of time, and at this point, I do what I always do at the end of our lesson, just because we've given a little teaser for next week that we're going to start with more stuff on idolatry and Judaism, but we are going to segue away from blessings over meals and move into blessings of occasion or blessings of circumstance. And there are a great many of them. And the way, the cadence with which the Mishnah concludes is really striking and beautiful. So we're going to have a really good time next week. And I didn't get a full poll on whether you want to study Avot or Mishnah Shabbat. It's almost a split vote. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for Avot, and 1, 2, 3, 4 for Shabbat. So maybe I'll just get to pick what I want and surprise you. In the meantime, stick around till next week because I'm not starting whatever comes after Brachot until 2 weeks from now. Let me just do a little bit of housekeeping as well, and then you can unmute yourself and say anything you like. Oh, Arlene, you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, in the bulletin, it said that there was not going to be a class next week on November 5th, but that there would be classes on the 12th and the 18th. So
yeah, that's weird. I'll make sure that gets corrected. There should be class next week.
Okay.
Unless everybody is scheduled against it, I would love to hold class next week. I think we'll need it. Also, I will be holding a forum on the election and Jewish interests on Sunday morning, the 8th of November at 11 a.m. We ask that you pre-register for that. You'll be given the Zoom link when you do. We also ask that you submit your questions in advance. You can wait until after the election, but you can't wait until the day of the event. So we ask that you submit them before the Friday of the week of the election. Obviously, we don't know anything today, and we may not even know anything by Sunday, the 8th of November. I hope we do. I hope we're not just kind of like in limbo land. It would be nice to know what's happening. But either way, we'll have, I think, a vigorous conversation, and I will share some of my own analysis of what it means for the Jewish community. My intention is to keep teaching through mid-December on Thursday mornings, so we should make a serious dent in whatever our next Mishnah tractate will be before I go on sabbatical. My sabbatical is probably from just after New Year's until the very end of Pesach, which is like April 3rd or 4th. And so we'll be on Mishnah hiatus through the winter, and we will resume after Pesach, and we'll have a 7-week Omer study. So we will study for the 7 weeks called the Omer, which are the period between Pesach and Shavuot, and we'll see where we're at. If we're really liking either Mishnah Shabbat or Mishnah Avot, we'll stick with that, or maybe we'll want to do the Mishnayot that pertain to that time of year. We'll do something fun. You will not be bereft of really good, vigorous learning during the winter months. My colleagues will continue to be teaching, and there will be lots of programming. I think most of it will continue to be online. That's my projection about where things are right now, so I just want to be upfront with you about that. Obviously, if the course of the pandemic makes it both permissible and wise for us to gather in small numbers in a safe way for in-person programming, we will, and we are doing that. We're just really limiting both the number and types of events as well as the size of the events that we're holding in person right now. So it's mostly life cycle right now, a little bit of in-person learning for our young students who really need that in-person socialization desperately. So we're trying in a safe way to do that. The class I most want to bring to your attention has actually already begun, but you're not behind. You'll learn about it in today's e-blast. My dear friend, Dr. Rachel Korazim, who has interfaced with WRT groups when I've taken trips to Israel with the temple, and who was our amazing, electrifying scholar in residence in 2016. Dr. Korazim is an Israeli educator and second-generation survivor of the Shoah. She is preeminent in her field, which is Israeli literature, but she also is just an incredible mind and heart and spirit. Dr. Korazim is teaching a twice-weekly class on the great classic and modern poets of Israel. The class is taught in English, it's over Zoom, and it's to an international audience. She already has 200 participants. I warmly encourage you to attend. You can attend starting today at 2 o'clock. The link is provided in the e-blast, I believe, or check the wrtemple.org website so you can get access to her class. She also will have a guest musician for most sessions. WRT has elected to sponsor a couple of her sessions on the poetess Zelda in March. So you'll see some of your WRT clergy faces a little bit down the road. But she's teaching this class every Tuesday and every Thursday, 2 o'clock p.m. Tuesdays are the classic poets of Israel, and Thursdays are the modern poets of Israel. Or maybe it's the other way around, don't quote me, but it's going to be awesome. She's just absolutely brilliant. If you've never learned with Dr. Korazim, just check out her classes online. She's fantastic. You'll really learn a lot. That's it for me. My intention is to keep teaching up until like right after Hanukkah. So probably our last class will be, I think it is the 17th of December, is a Thursday. And then after that, we'll be on winter break, followed by my sabbatical. Thank you. You have all been so supportive. And I'm taking a sabbatical precisely because I know how strong and vibrant this congregation is, and also how strong and vibrant the clergy team and the rest of the staff are and will be in my absence. So thank you so much.
Dr. and Mrs. Blake, it's so nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Thank you very much. Good to
Thank
see you as well, Joe.
I took a
Remember us sitting together at Temple one day?
Absolutely.
It was really great.
I
Thank
took
you.
a class this past summer at Hebrew University, a 4-credit class for my master's degree with Rachel Korazin. She insists on Rachel, not Rachel.
I know.
And she was, I just had the best, and I don't do well with poetry. And man, I'm ready to teach it. She was so good.
Just please take my word on this one. Rachel is a person that the saying goes, when you love a teacher, I would listen to that teacher read the phone book. Rachel, I would listen to read the phone book. She is absolutely phenomenal as an educator. So check her out. I'll see you in a week. We'll complete, I believe, our study of Mishna Berakhot, and maybe we'll even, maybe bring some libations with you. We'll need to be drinking on November 5th one way or another. Some of us will be celebrating and some of us will be mourning. Talk to you then. Bye.
Calling all
Thank
chats.
you.
Calling all chats.
No,
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Sei gesund.
Sei gesund.